Well, I appreciate everybody joining us. So just as a quick introduction, like Jeremy mentioned, this is a recurring theme apparently for February. So I'll take my 3-year return with a grin. Today it's actually really reminiscent of a conversation that I had with the meetup about 2 years ago. This one's a little bit more in depth and a little bit more oriented around like the larger integration of Security Hub. But we do near the end, I'm going to dive really deep and get really hands-on with some specific use cases and kind of go through a little bit of a demo as well. So a little bit of background as to who I am. I've been working at AWS for about 1.5 years now. Prior to that, I worked at some larger financial institutions for 1 and 6 years respectively, primarily building and operationalizing cloud security within AWS, among other cloud providers. So yeah, I wanted to go ahead and jump into it and kind of dig into the larger security ecosystem at AWS to begin with. So I've aligned this presentation or this slide to the cybersecurity framework. And so you can see that we do attempt to align with each of those domains or each of those pillars of the CSF. And so what we're going to end up talking about today primarily is around the identify and the detect, or identify through detect. And then at the very end, we're going to look at the respond piece as part of automation and kind of that security operations approach around the automation. To begin with, though, I want to talk about all of the services or some of the services that are going to be informing the overall security posture of your AWS environment. And so AWS has a very healthy stack of security services that are built for specific use cases. I want to go through some of those on the front end just to kind of explain how they feed into the larger Security Hub conversation. But at the same time, the slides will get a lot more sparse after this, I promise. So to begin with, Amazon Guard Duty, we're going to apply machine learning and for anomaly detection in S3, RDS, and across your compute plane. So that's going to provide that initial insight of threat detection. Inspector is going to be looking more at the vulnerability management of both containers and compute as well. That's going to generate findings that are going to inform you on outstanding attack surface and ways that you can reduce that. Amazon CloudWatch is going to provide that logging area for that account level centralization of logs. It's going to be leveraged also to take those existing logs, provide metrics and thereby alerts. And that's another kind of critical piece that ends up informing a lot of the conversation around the security approach. Config is really key to a lot of this conversation. It does continual assessments for configuration compliance based on rules that you deploy. And we're going to get into those a little bit more in depth as a part of the conversation with Security Hub. Firewall Manager and Network Firewall are both your infrastructure layer of security. Firewall Manager is also going to have connectivity or have aggregation for control and management of AWS Shield and AWS WAF. So with Shield, you're going to have the basic DDoS protection. There's also Shield Advanced, which provides a little bit more of a hands-on kind of incident response team from AWS, as well as a couple of other benefits. WAF is your web application firewall, where you can deploy the rule-based firewall rules. Systems Manager is going to help with that remediation that we'll get to in a little bit. Systems Manager, going back to the previous slide talking about Inspector, where Inspector will detect those vulnerabilities, Systems Manager will integrate with the compute layer to remediate them. And then with Macie is going to be your data protection. So from sensitive data discovery or data classification, all of those are going to be things that are produced as a part of the Macy service itself. And then there are some other pieces of this automated response, but the two pieces I really wanted to dig into or highlight as a part of this right now was Event Bridge and Detective. Detective is going to provide some ingestion and investigation. Think of it as like your tier 1 SOC analyst aggregating multiple threat intel feeds and providing correlation for them. With Event Bridge is going to give you that automation aspect of this remediation. We'll dig into Event Bridge really hands-on as a part of the demo, but the way at a high level it works is the way we'll use it is we'll actually be looking for a pattern-based event or a pattern-based message that we're going to use patterns to match messages and use those to inform the automated response later on. And so that brings us finally to Security Hub. And so Security Hub fits kind of as an integral part within the ecosystem of all of the other services that we were talking about, as well as a bunch of other partner solutions that I'll mention in a little bit. But the biggest takeaway is Security Hub is really broken down into two main use cases or main uses. One's going to be the aggregation and prioritization of those threat feeds and security posture information that you're getting from the native services. But then you've also got another portion of Security Hub that manages security checks. And those security checks are based off of best practices and industry standards. And we'll actually use one of those checks as a part of the demo shortly. And then between those automated checks and the security findings that you're getting from other tools, you're able to aggregate all of those into a centralized place that you can then take action from. I'm always thinking about applying things at scale. So when you're talking about at scale, all of these services provide organization-wide visibility and organization-wide response capabilities, even if it's centralized in a single account in the form of Security Hub. Security Hub is going to be able to do that cross-account and cross-region remediation of findings, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So I've been talking about a lot of the services. Just to highlight a couple of them here. With Trusted Advisor, you're going to be able to get detection of deviations from those best practices that are defined. And Trusted Advisor is a free service that's basically best practice oriented, making sure that customers are at least getting the bare minimum of hygiene and best practices. With Guard Duty, like I mentioned, it's going to provide the anomalous behavior detection and threat detection, but with using the ML efforts on the back end to aggregate a lot of the threat feeds. From Macy, it's going to be discovering sensitive data and providing findings for either data that has been classified or categorized, or data that has been detected as being inappropriately handled, as well as other data-oriented notifications and messages. And then, like I mentioned before, with Inspector, you've got that infrastructure layer of intel coming in, giving you visibility into the attack surface of your compute nodes. And then Security Hub is going to be that aggregation place where everything comes in, you have that visibility. And in a couple more slides, we'll talk more about it. But the biggest piece and the biggest value from having this aggregation is each of these services have their own purpose-built events that they're generating. There are internal tools that are used that are going to leverage those findings. But when you get to Security Hub is going to give you that overarching visibility in a standardized approach where you're not necessarily having to sort through a bunch of different messages. Like I said, we'll talk about it more in a little bit, but it's going to standardize all of these findings into what's called the Amazon Security Findings format. And we'll actually take a look at it in a second. So we talked about the aggregation from the services. Here's the security standards that are deployed, or an example of the security standards deployed from Security Hub. In this case, we're talking about the CIS benchmarks, but you can also see on that screenshot, we've got PCI DSS and the foundational best practices. So these are basically going to give you a quick snapshot of being able to take a look at the posture based off of some industry standards and being able to work against those. In addition to these standards, these are the ones that are pre-packaged in Security Hub. I shouldn't say these, this is CIS, but we're also talking about PCI DSS and the foundational best practices. There's also the availability of using the conformance packs through config. Config will actually feed, like we were talking about a second ago, it'll feed those findings for compliance deviations into Security Hub, but it won't necessarily show you in Security Hub the percentage score as you're seeing it here. And I mentioned earlier, I'm all about talking about deployments and management at scale. So once you actually start enrolling or enabling Security Hub, you have the availability of actually using what's called delegated administration. With that, you're able to assign all of the responsibilities of management and administration of the Security Hub infrastructure and organization, all within a single account. And that single account can then manage the organizational accounts involvement or inclusion in the Security Hub service. So with those two checkboxes, you can see you have control over rolling out those default standards to new accounts, as well as actually always auto-enrolling new accounts at the time of their creation. So everything we've been talking about has been kind of looking at the per account or the integrations with Security Hub itself. When we start looking at kind of a larger picture, we are going to want to find or have an understanding of how those findings are managed and how they're actually handled across regions and across accounts. So the biggest takeaway is that with Security Hub, you'll actually have a centralized place to have the findings across your organization. But then at the account level, you're also going to have Security Hub providing users with access to those findings where they can take action and they can take responsibility to respond and not necessarily have to rely on a security team coming to them. In a past life, it was very helpful to kind of enable those development teams and those product teams by saying, hey, you know that the security team is going to come by every month or every week asking about these things. Go ahead and here's how you can get ahead of it so you don't even have to be bothered. Go ahead and work that into your development process. And the teams themselves are able to adopt and manage that workload at the team level, as opposed to having to rely on security to become the task masters, if you will. So we've been talking about how everything is flowing into Security Hub. The next piece is what happens after it gets into Security Hub. Obviously, you're going to have the visibility on the dashboard that we'll take a look at in a second, but you're going to have findings, or you're going to have the availability of pulling findings in from the security services, the compliance checks we talked about, the partners that you may have that you want to integrate into your overall security operations effort. And in this case, it may be things that are attack surface related, or it could be even endpoint related. The findings themselves coming through the partners will also be produced in that Amazon security findings format. And so it's all going to fall into the same operational efforts without having to take massive considerations for one tool versus another, or one service versus another. In addition to this, which is not actually on this diagram, you have, well, actually, it kind of is. It says partner and custom events. The icons there are some other partners, but custom events can also come from development teams or customers themselves. So it's not uncommon for customers to adopt that Amazon security finding format, build their own events, and push their own events into Security Hub alongside the services and the partners. That gives them the availability of interfacing through a centralized security platform, but also providing a level of granularity and customization that they may need beyond what's available. And that's simply an API call into Security Hub. And I'm about to jump on the security findings format in the next slide. But then after all those findings get there, it's basically what happens next. And what happens next is the ingestion into EventBridge or investigations from detective or both. So let's go ahead and go the route of the EventBridge piece. Once those findings are digested or ingested into Security Hub, Security Hub is going to be able to parse those, or I should say EventBridge is going to be able to parse those findings in Security Hub based off of event patterns that you can build. And that's actually part of the demo that we'll go into. But once you've identified those patterns and you've detected the events that you want to take action on, the question then becomes, what action do you want to take? Those events, for the most part, are going to give you enough contextual information to immediately take action based off of the values that are found in the event itself. So one of the things that we'll look at is that along that top line, once EventBridge detects the event that it's looking for, it's going to pass that event on to Lambda, and Lambda is going to be able to take that information, parse it, and then take action based on the information in that event. So I want to really quickly talk about the extent of the Amazon security finding format. I talked a second ago about the ability for people to create their own findings and post them into Security Hub. It is a standardized format, but what I really want to highlight here is the availability and variety, and really the extent that you can go into with the services and the detail around, or the metadata around the event that you're actually generating. And all of these are actionable within the AWS platform through EventBridge, through Lambda. All of these are values that you can make actionable as a part of your security operations program. Really quickly, I want to highlight kind of the breadth of our integrations with partners, be it firewalls, vulnerability management, endpoint management, compliance, or a variety of other toolings that don't fall within those categories. Security Hub can really work as that centralized point to ingest all of those. And then on the other end of the process, where you're not taking immediate remediation steps, you can take action in the sense of pushing these events or meaningful events to your SIEM, your SOAR tool, or even just your notification tools. If it's a critical event on a critical piece of infrastructure, maybe it's worth hitting PagerDuty and notifying the team that's on call. Or maybe it's only worth hitting ServiceNow or Atlassian, Jira, and putting a ticket in. Those are options that you have. I'm going to skip over this because we're going to go into detail on this in the demo, but this is very similar to what we'll end up looking at with the way that EventBridge is capturing and doing that pattern matching. And real quick, just as a kind of a high level recap or application of what we talked about, you really kind of, we really see three primary use cases or patterns that kind of repeat themselves with customers. And that includes the centralization of the security and compliance findings. And that's just getting everything into a centralized place where they can then do that integration downstream. That's that further enablement. But a lot of customers we see come in with a desire and an interest to improve the security posture of their environment, but they don't really have a good way to cohesively bring it all together, and they're working across multiple tools and services. The next step in that process typically is where a customer will route all of these findings comprehensively, or a sub portion or a subsegment of them, to a SIEM tool as a pure aggregation. So instead of doing the AWS layer of remediation or the AWS layer of action, the SIEM may be the end all be all, or the final destination for those findings, where the security team itself can go through and build those playbooks or build those responses in a more enterprise manner. And then obviously the last one I mentioned earlier, how account teams are able, or I should say product teams are able to leverage the Security Hub dashboard at the account level. And that really enables them to be able to take action before having security or an operations team come and ask questions. I'm going to jump straight into the demo. I'm going to walk through a bunch of this as we go, since we do have the time. But just as a high level overview, what we're going to see is the Security Hub console. And that console has deployed through config some of those standards. I'm using the Amazon foundational security best practices, security foundational best practice, that one. And we'll be deploying rules that are associated with that, or they've already been deployed. Those rules will evaluate resources. And what we'll do is we'll actually create a couple of EC2 instances with a couple of different characteristics and see how that response actually differs based on those EC2s. And one of those EC2s will actually create a compliance deviation that we've built automated remediation for. And so when that config rule detects that compliance change, EventBridge will take that event, parse the event into Lambda, where Lambda will take automated remediation. At the same time, we're going to have that same EventBridge action fan out in the event-driven architecture kind of model, where the event itself will fan out both to a SNS topic, where it will send me an email or two, which we'll also talk about, and then it'll also take action based on the information by Lambda. So give me a second. Let me hop into that. Let's try to make a little bit better of a view. There we go. That didn't help much, but anyway, so right off the bat, you're going to see the security standards that we were looking at, which are at this point, I've only got the security foundational best practices deployed. And then you can see here a couple of failed or high count failures associated with resources. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and dig into these findings. Actually, hold on. While we're looking at these findings, I'm going to launch the EC2 instances, or an EC2 instance, and we'll see how it picks up some of the changes that we're deploying. It takes about 4 minutes for an instance to get going. So it'll take a little bit of time for those findings to come in, but we'll definitely be able to see it for sure. And all I'm going to do right here is just go through and use some existing resources that we have. instead of creating additional ones. And I'm going to launch this instance. So instance 871, we'll look back at that in a second. So what we have here is here we go. We have here are the findings that are actually produced into Security Hub. These findings are both aggregated by product as well as by the accounts themselves. So in this case, what we're looking at is we're looking at a bunch of config themselves that have been deployed or that are in breach of compliance. And then we also have some Security Hub managed rules that are also in breach. So just as a quick kind of comparison between the two, these aren't the same finding, but there's one thing that you'll kind of see different between the config rules and Security Hub. Within Security Hub, within the config rules, it has a bunch of the information around the event itself, as well as the actual text of the event. So you can see the full text of the event that's generated. However, when you go to the Security Hub finding, you'll see that there's another category down here for remediation. And with Security Hub best practices, it actually gives you remediation responses for how to resolve the issues that have been detected. So I'm not going to go into it right this second, but this will take you to a web page that will walk you through the efforts or walk you through the practices to remediate this finding directly. This is also something that you, if you're using the Amazon Security Findings format to import your own findings, this is actually something that you can populate yourself. So from a security operations perspective, when security teams are building notifications or events, they have the option to include remediation efforts to communicate to the product or the account owners, which will allow that just a little bit easier or a little bit more of a unified response around remediating those findings. We can see config and we can see Security Hub. I'm not sure if I've still got some guard duty or not. So let's see if I can search for. Yeah. So in this case, this is actually, you can see here. You can see here that now we're looking at guard duty related findings. And these findings you can tell are newly created. You can see when the compliance status was last updated, and you can dig into the actual finding itself. From here, you can build additional remediation because, again, you're going to have the full text of the anomalous behavior, and you'll be able to take action based off of the values inside this. And we'll dig a little bit more into that in just one split second. So let's go back over to EC2. All right, we can see that this instance, which ends in 871, is now up and running. And already we can see that it's failed a bunch of security checks. So we can drill down and investigate the specific findings that it's been identified as breaching. But as you can see, none of those have actually changed anything about this instance. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to terminate this instance. And over time, both over time as well as by modifying this instance, what will happen is those findings associated with it in Security Hub will actually auto remediate themselves. They'll still show in Security Hub if you were to look for them, but they'll actually come up as archived. Now we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to create a public facing instance. I'm going to do that by going down here, editing the VPC information, and it's already going to be in a public subnet. So I'm just going to enable auto assign public IP. We'll grab the default security group, and we'll just launch that instance. So what's going to happen now is that instance is going to obviously generate some findings like we just saw with the previous one, but it's going to generate another finding specifically around the fact that I made it a public facing instance. And so the way to see the difference in what's actually happening here, let's go to EventBridge. So what I've done is I've created an event, or I've created a pattern that matches Security Hub findings, where that ASFF format produces a findings with a workflow status of new, a record state of active, because if it auto remediates before it gets here, I'm not necessarily worried about it. Compliance, I specifically want to target EC 2.9. And I will actually show what that means in just a second. And I want to see when that EC 2.9 fails or has a failed status. Now, when I detect that event coming into EventBridge from Security Hub, I'm going to do 4 things all at once. This first one, I'm going to log it to a log group that I've identified specifically for that finding, but you don't have to be that specific. It can be a more aggregated approach for a log group. I'm going to have it send an SNS alert to my operations alerts SNS topic, which is tied to my email address. I'm going to skip down here, the third one. I'm going to have it do the exact same thing for that operations topic, except down here, I've actually done an input transform. And the reason I've done an input transform is I want this notification to be human readable, and I want this notification to be meaningful to the person who's getting it. So what I've done is I've gone through and using that same ASF format, I've identified, well, let me back up, using the message or the event that was generated in the ASF format, I've parsed basically data that I find will be of value to someone who needs to be aware of it. And then down here, I've basically plugged all of those values in to make it a human readable kind of approach. And the very last thing, the fourth thing, is going to be, we're going to push this to an EC2, to a Lambda. And that Lambda has a very simple code. There it is. And it's going to take those same findings or those same values that we had from those findings, and it's going to use those to stop the EC2 instance. So earlier, when I created the EC2 instance, it identified the fact that it had findings. It identified that there were findings associated with that instance, but it didn't take action. So now what we're going to do is we're going to give teeth to the response. And we're going to say, if it's detected where the public IP or a publicly facing EC2 is detected, we want to take the information from that finding, parse that data in the Lambda compute, and then shut down the instance that's detected in that event. So that means that if I've talked long enough, yeah, cool. If I've talked long enough, you can see there how this instance is currently stopping. Well, earlier it didn't stop. The biggest difference is that when we go over here, we can now go over to monitor, and we can see where this Lambda had been invoked today. And when it was invoked, it went through and gave the command to begin stopping this instance. And now, well, I was hoping by the time I got done with that sentence, it would be stopped, but it's going through that process. Separately, if I can get to my inbox, I can show you first. Oh. First, it's going to show you the total event, and that's going to be from that first portion of the event bridge response. This is it just forwarding me the event. So this is the event in plain or in JSON format. Separately, I've got another email that's very human readable that explains the instance that I created, which we can validate in a second, is in violation of, and it provides the title of the control, and then even provides the remediation steps for the owner. So if the owner never went to Security Hub itself, security operations would be able to provide actionable, meaningful steps to fix the issue where or if they weren't able to fix it themselves. So in this case, what you may want to do is change this wording to also inform, by the way, because this was detected, we've also shut the instance down. It could be shut the instance down. It could be restart the instance. It could be terminate. It could be a number of things. Whatever action you want to take based off of the data within the event that's being parsed by the Lambda is all within your reach. And so at this point, we've got the event bridge, or excuse me, the config rule, which was detected. And let's go back and look at that. Again, we're talking about the instance that ends in 279. So you can see 279 here is now at the top of our list. We can drill down and see all of the other controls that are in violation on this instance. So we can then use this information to identify what instances are the highest threat, what instances are at our potential of producing the larger attack surface, and then build strategies around resolving them. Typically, from a maturation perspective, what you see customers doing is taking these findings that they are being generated by best practices, building remediation where necessary, but building preventative controls where they can. So while you can't necessarily, or you can't easily prevent the creation of an EC2 instance with that specific value enabled through like service control policies as a preventative control, you can take action by using Security Hub and these other security services as a form of remediation for corrective controls. With that, do I have any questions from the audience? Anybody?
That's good, man. I enjoy that.
Cool. More of a comment than a question.
Yeah.
I was just making a joke, sorry.
Oh, I follow. Comments are always welcome too, Justin.
I liked it a lot. I would just like to see, some different logos on some of those slides, but I really enjoyed the presentation.
That is a very, very, very fair assessment.
I like Symantec on there, but not us. But yeah, no, I really like it. I like how everything kind of flows together, and you can, use the AWS native stuff. It's really come a long way with what you can do in Security Hub.
Yeah, and to kind of tip a hat to the partners as well. this is something that's very doable, right? But it takes time, it takes effort. Hunters in here, we can have conversations about the level of hands-on effort that it would take or does take to build some of these things. So when you're talking about needing to get bang for the buck and get up and running, there's definitely a value to having those conversations with partners. But at the same time, it's not something that is outside of the reach of the smaller company or the end user to take either basic or even advanced security controls into their own hands without actually having to worry about any sort of obstacles for engaging with a larger company. Then again, just so it's said, a lot of those obstacles have also been removed thanks to Marketplace. So, if a company has an approachable billing model, it's definitely worth checking out if you don't want to take the time to build it yourself. Well, awesome. I know we've got just a little bit of time left, but if there were any other questions or comments, I'd be happy to kind of poke around in the environment, kind of look into the existing architecture, or just give you guys 10 minutes back and have a great afternoon.